My name is Jan Macvarish. I'm the Education and Events Director of the Free Speech Union, and it's my very great pleasure to welcome you all to tonight's event, taking place here in a packed room in central London and with well over 400 people, members of the Free Speech Union, joining online. This evening, we are here to discuss the latest work by one of our most industrious and prolific public intellectuals, Professor Frank Furedi. This is the launch event for his new book, The War Against the Past, Why the West Must Fight for Its History. Although it has actually sold out, so you may struggle to get your hands on a copy unless you've pre-ordered. But you can, and I'm going to whisper this, go to Amazon and buy a copy there instead if you're desperate. If you've ordered it online, that should get delivered to you next week from our bookseller, Primrose Hill Books. Frank is Emeritus Professor of Sociology at the University of Kent here in the UK and Executive Director of the muscular think tank MCC Brussels. I think think tank doesn't really do justice to what MCC Brussels does. Frank has written more than 26 books devoted to understanding cultural developments in Western societies. And since my undergraduate years, I've been incredibly grateful for his ability to identify key trends and to condense them into accessible and usable concepts that can help to unlock the way we understand the world, whether that was paranoid parenting, the culture of fear, therapy culture, the importance of borders, the long-running Western identity crisis, the crisis of authority. All of these concepts have been incredibly helpful, I've found, and I think a lot of other people too. I think it's testament to the number of people in the room. We've found his work very, very helpful for understanding the present and the past. Another of his books was titled Where Have All the Intellectuals Gone? And we're very fortunate to have located at least two and to have pinned them to their chairs on the panel tonight. Two intellectuals still standing to speak to us tonight because after Frank's introductory lecture, we'll hear from our second eminent guest, Professor Jonathan Clarke. Professor Clarke has taught at Cambridge, at Oxford, and the universities of Chicago and Kansas. His latest book is called The Enlightenment, An Idea and Its History, and I've just started it. It's absolutely fantastic. And you'll notice that if you can get your hands on a copy of Frank's book, you'll notice that even very early on in his book, he refers to Jonathan's earlier book, Our Shadowed Present, Modernism, Postmodernism and History, and cites it a number of times throughout his book. So Frank's going to speak for 30 minutes. Then Professor Clarke will respond for 15. And we'll come out to you, the audience, shortly afterwards for your questions, including some from our online audience who are joining us online tonight. So for those of you who are on the live stream, please write your questions in the Q&A box. There isn't a chat box, so just write your questions, pithy if you can, in the Q&A box, and we'll try to take at least a couple of those. You can also upvote other people's questions to indicate which ones you think are the most important. So can we please put our hands together to welcome our speakers, Professor Frank Furedi and Professor Jonathan Clarke. And Frank, if you'd like to head to the lectern, thank you.
Good evening, everybody, and I'm very grateful for the Free Speech Union for providing an opportunity to talk about the book and maybe have a conversation about it. I wrote this book because at some point I realized that the culture wars, which is something I'm very interested in, and feel it's one of the most important problems of our time. I felt that the culture wars had shifted from its focus on the present, dealing with merely present-day concerns, back into the past. And more and more of the work that culture warriors were engaged in were really about things like questioning the historical foundations of the United States, questioning the foundations of Britain and British society, indeed going back so far as to question even the legitimacy of the Greeks, the ancient Greeks, calling into question the achievements of the Greeks, and similarly with the Renaissance, similarly with the Enlightenment, just basically trying to take down everybody who's anybody within the Western cultural space. So I figured that it was very important to understand what is really going on, why they're doing this, what's the issue that's at stake. And I began to explore this. And the thing that I was surprised by, I kind of imagined when I began my research that this was just merely another example of rewriting history, which happens all the time. I thought this was just merely another example of historical revisionism, which again takes place, virtually every decade of every century in the modern era. It's quite common to read books that call into question previous interpretations of what happened in the past. But in this instance, what we're seeing today is not simply a revision of what has happened, not just simply rewriting what has taken place, but literally treating the past as an enemy territory, as a territory that you want to colonize and enter and almost render toxic. It's almost as if your job in the culture wars is to contaminate everything about the past that we think was good, positive, every ideal that we, particularly in Western civilization, have embraced as really integral to our very humanity and to our existence. And in a most cynical, sort of skeptical, systematic kind of a way, they kind of move from one target. So one day, it's Aristotle who gets accused of being the father of white supremacy. Next day, you move from Aristotle to Chaucer. Poor old Chaucer, all of a sudden, becomes complicit in slavery and racism, which is very difficult when you read The Wife of Bath to see exactly what they're getting at. But they are so good at twisting the words and the language that they could literally basically get everybody charged with some kind of a hate crime or some kind of an offensive sort of behavior. So basically, this is what got me going. So the point I want to really emphasize is this is very different. If you take, for example, some of the most radical revisers of history, take someone like Lenin or Gramsci or Marxists that have been around for throughout the 20th century, they basically also criticized the past. They called into question the existing interpretations of the British Empire, the existing interpretations of what happened in the United States of capitalism. But nevertheless, they still respected the past. They still felt that there were people in the past that were their heroes. It would be some Spartacus or some rebel in the Peasants' Rebellion. They would still see some positive singles, and they would look at the past with respect. Gramsci, for example, when he was in his prison, wrote about the way in which it's so important for any cultured person to take seriously Greek and Roman civilization. And he told his son that you're not going to be an educated person unless you learn Greek and Latin. That's a subliminal note to my son who's guilty of the crime of giving it up at a certain point. But anyway, that's on a personal note. So basically, it was completely beyond question that all the revisers in the past at least took the past seriously. The people that are around today take no prisoners. It's almost as if the past itself is this stark, alien, sordid territory. And they don't have any heroes. They're not really saying, well, at least in this period in the West, there was something great that was going on. Their job is very simply to, in a sense, impose a quarantine on the past. It's almost as if what they really are trying to do was to render the past so toxic that we have got to build a wall between ourselves and what happened in the past. So that's, to me, is really sort of quite interesting. And in a sense, what they're doing is they're canceling, to use their phrase, Western civilization by eliminating or trying to eliminate society's historical memory. The memory that we have, that we grew up with, about what happened in the 19th or 18th or 17th century. And to realize this objective, what they've done, and this I think is the most fascinating topic that I was dealing with, what they're really doing is they're erasing the temporal distinction between the present and the past. You know, we all grew up with the idea that there is the past and there is the present and there is future. And in our minds, we all have at least a kind of metaphorical way of seeing a border between these different domains of temporality. Or what they've done, in a sense, is basically got rid of the border or the boundary between the present and the past, and they almost effortlessly, casually go back and forth. And they treat the past as if it's the present. I call it ever-present. What they've done is by eroding these distinctions, the present, what we see as the present, expands into the past, but it also expands into the future. So it's a kind of presentist ideology that they have developed and they've kind of promoted. It's a point I want to get back to because I think this is one of the crucial distinctions that is occurring now. But there's a paradox. There's a paradox that I draw attention to, what I call the paradox of history, which is they're doing things that are at first contradictory. On the one hand, they try to decouple the present from the past. They actually sort of try to make sure that people like you and me, and especially our children, have got no sense of what has gone on beforehand, that they become completely oblivious to the experience of previous generations. And I call this a kind of year zero ideology. A year zero ideology basically means that everything that has gone on before now is bad and even malevolent. Anything that is potentially good begins with us. In other words, this is the key sort of way that this is regarded. And very often when you see them writing about people in the past or events in the past, there's a kind of contempt, there's a kind of sense of self-flattery that we are better, much, much better, and have much greater kind of moral sensibilities than all these people that had existed beforehand. So on the one hand, they try to quarantine, but when I say quarantine, I really mean a real cordon sanitaire, because it's not just simply that they're trying to make us forget what has happened, they're also trying to change the language that we use. Right? If you noticed, for example, if you go to the bookshop in any bookstore and you buy a novel by Virginia Woolf or any of the great novelists of the 20th, 19th century, there will be increasingly a little note in the book, if it's been reprinted recently, which basically goes like this. They will say that Virginia Woolf wrote this novel in 1922, and she used the language of her time. And the implication being that poor old Virginia Woolf, was so clumsy and so silly that she used the language of her time. Well, presumably, she couldn't have used the language of our time because she wasn't really part of that. But the phrase of her time, the implication being that that language is something that we need to abandon, suggests that there's words and expressions that are, by definition, offensive to the ears of a sensitive 21st century undergraduate at Durham University. So basically, what's happening is that the language itself is being called into question. And very often, if you look at language guides, they use a phrase time and time again that I really hate. In fact, it's become my favorite hate word. The word they use is outdated. This word is outdated. It's a bit like you get a can of yogurt. Yes, it is outdated because it will go off if you eat it today. But the idea that the words that our parents used, words like mother and father, call me old-fashioned. I still use those words. Or husband and wife, and not using the word partner is a cultural crime from their sort of particular point of view. So what they're gradually trying to do is to put a quarantine around many of the most important words that we are using. And that's important because if you don't use the word husband and wife anymore, then you forget that there's a relationship between a husband and wife, a human relationship, which is very different than having a partner, right? When they started using the word partner or referring to their lovers and girlfriends and husbands and wives as partner, I thought it was like a business arrangement. That's why you had partners, where I come from. But now, what you have is essentially the loss of clarity about what we knew were specific relationships living in a particular kind of context. So on the first hand, they try to decouple the past, us from the past. But at the same time, and this is where the paradox is, they're desperately trying to colonize it. This is where I meant that there's an erosion of temporal distinctions. It's almost as if they're trying to colonize the past, and they're trying to go into the 19th century, the 18th century. They're even trying to go into ancient Egypt and put right the mistake of the pharaohs, or put right the fact that these silly Greeks in Athens had slaves, and therefore their democracy ideals must be tainted and corroded. We can't really take that seriously. So they're trying to colonize the past, and what they are really doing is treating someone like Immanuel Kant or someone like David Hume as their peers. Not as somebody that lived a long time ago, but as their peers. So they do things like write an article about the fact that if Immanuel Kant was around today, then the language he would use would be different. They're sure about that. They probably know better than Immanuel Kant what he thought. And therefore, they feel that they got the moral authority to correct Immanuel Kant. Because they think that Immanuel Kant would have wanted to express himself in that way. In other words, if Immanuel Kant was as aware as we are, he would not have written his basic kind of writings on ethics and other stuff in the way that he did. Or Shakespeare, poor old Shakespeare. Poor old Shakespeare is now become subjected to all kinds of revisions. For example, there is a play that he wrote. I can never pronounce the name. It's Titus, whatever it is. You know what I'm talking about. And some people have decided that they have to make that play sound more racist. They're going to put in words that are more offensive and racist because they think that when Shakespeare wrote this play, he had real racialistic ideals in his mind. And they want to make us sensitive to the fact that actually when push comes to shove, Shakespeare was a white supremacist. So in this way, what they're doing is they're colonizing the life world of previous generations and imposing themselves, inserting themselves in relation to that. And not just that, but they're imposing their values. So, for example, you will have heard of the queering of history. And you might think it's a joke, but it isn't. I had the pleasure, day before yesterday, of looking at the Harvard University's history courses of the history department. Harvard, as you probably know, is not like a comprehensive school, or it's not like one of those polytechnics, that were called universities. In England, you had this thing, one day a polytechnic, fish and something changed into something else. So basically, what they essentially have done is gone back to ancient Egypt and looked at the remains, because there are remains in Egypt if you dig deeply in the pyramids, and they decided that it's completely wrong to say that the remains in those places are even though the DNA samples are very clear on it, that the remains are of a man or of a woman. And the reason for that is because how do we know how they would have identified themselves? Right? How do we know? And therefore, there is now within archaeology a serious group of archaeologists who simply refuse to indicate that the human remains they find are of a man or of a woman or a boy or a girl. They think that is offensive and, again, a crime against humanity or culture. And they do this all the time. They go back and, for example, these days, you will have read that every time they come across a strong woman in the past, like amongst the Greeks or the Romans or Middle Ages, and there were strong women, to be sure, they basically decide that a strong woman by definition, couldn't have been a woman, or certainly couldn't have been a heterosexual woman. She had to be sexually either ambivalent or asexual or lesbian. I mean, there's a kind of queering process that goes on, and you kind of think, were there any heterosexual people around in the Renaissance era? Right? Because you would imagine there must have been one or two. Otherwise there wouldn't have been the rebirth of another generation. Right? Something must have been going on that doesn't quite fit into the queering of history. But nevertheless, they're absolutely certain, absolutely kind of clear that this is what has really gone there. So you got this paradox between cutting ourselves off from the past at the same time colonizing it. I call that the paradox of the past, and I think it's really worth looking at the ambiguity in relation to that. Now, one of the ways in which they proceed, and these are professional historians, is this. You know, when I was studying history, one of the first things I was told that the use of anachronism was a sin, was illegitimate. And all historians understood this. Anachronism means reading history backwards and basically not just simply seeing the past from your point of view, but interpreting what has gone on in the past from our mental and intellectual outlook. In other words, eliding the distinction between the way we look at things and the way that people have done that. Well, now, a lot of, particularly American historians, and American historians are the worst in this regard, not even the British are as bad as that. American historians have basically arguing that anachronism is actually a good thing, that presentism, the use of anachronisms, is a sensitive way of making sense of what's gone in the past. So therefore, they don't feel there's anything wrong with reading history backward. They think that's the way in which you put right the mistakes of the past. They actually use expressions like, we're going to fix the problems of the past. And that's a feature of this war against the past, that these people are not spending very much energy fixing the problems of today. They're much more comfortable with fixing the problems that emerged in the Roman Empire or emerged in the Middle Ages. So that kind of anachronism is really quite important. And I call that not just anachronism, but moral anachronism. And the reason why I use the term moral anachronism is because they don't just simply read history backwards, they basically morally condemn the people of the past, their targets, as being their moral inferiors. And this is a very important point. They don't just simply say that someone like Immanuel Kant or someone like David Hume or Matthew or Arnold didn't know as much as we do, which is true. People living in the 18th century didn't know as much as we do in the 21st. They also say that these people weren't as good as we are. They were on a lower human plane. They're morally inferior to who we are. And that anachronism is then used to flatter ourselves that we basically, at the University of Berkeley in California, are so aware, so much sensitive about the predicament of humanity than these morally low individuals. And that kind of flattering is something that you can see all the way through. And what moral anachronism does is it gives them the warrant to lecture everybody that has lived and done great things for Western civilization over the centuries. I mean, they literally give little lectures, little kind of moral lectures. So, for example, you saw a few days ago, I think it was last week, it was reported that the painting of Constable, John Constable, in the National Gallery, this very famous painting, the Hay Vane, which is of an idyllic rural scene, was flawed. And you ask, there's a little kind of sign up there. And that basically suggests that there's a problem with the painting. And the problem is not what Constable painted, but what he didn't paint. Because they actually think that what Constable should have done is painted a picture of grinding rural poverty in England. That would have been cool. That would have been really good. But if you paint a nice picture that relaxes you of an idyllic rural scene, that again is something that is quite unacceptable. So here you have the National Gallery, And you know the kind of people that run the National Gallery. I mean, you know, in a different era, they would have worked in a post office, you know, sort of on a part-time basis, you know. But now they're running the National Gallery. And they actually think that they got the authority to reprimand Constable for the fact that his artistic imagination drew him towards a certain representation of rural beauty rather than towards horrific, grinding poverty. So that's really what we're having all the time. And we're having that with lots of different kind of individuals. One of the consequences of this is that as this war against the past continues, it tries to create either subliminally or more consciously a kind of sense of historical amnesia, where bit by bit we forget. We forget a lot because we no longer see those beautiful achievements that we have in the past. Bit by bit, we forget what really happened. Bit by bit, people become confused, especially the young. Imagine Sweden, where you have the Swedish equivalent to the BBC, spending millions, tens of millions on a historical, 10-part historical program about the history of Sweden. It's the most expensive TV program they've ever made. And the 10-part program begins by lecturing or telling people that actually the people that originated Sweden, that kind of began the adventure of being Swedish, weren't white, right? They didn't have blonde hair or, you know, white skin or blue eyes, but they came from Africa, or they were black. Now, you know, at first you think that they're taking the piss. You think this is like a comedy sort of program, which is legitimate. I think it's quite legitimate to have kind of hysterical historical dramas, but they are deadly serious. And it isn't just simply in Sweden that you kind of have this kind of almost like a very crude attempt to distort the most foundational, fundamental elements of our historical experience. It's something that is, you know, happening all the time. That's what the queering of history is really all about. And this is important because the reason why this is happening in part is because they sneak in a past. They kind of sneakily bring out a past, and Netflix is the most systematic advocate of this, that legitimates contemporary identity obsessions. Right? If you look at TV programs on Netflix, I mean, basically, again, it's very difficult to find any heterosexuals in a 14th century drama, except for the drunks and the criminals, you know, and the wife beaters. They're like the heterosexual man. Everybody else is, you know, on a different planet, you know, sort of. And, you know, this is the 14th century where people were so tired by the time they finished work that they certainly didn't have a lot of time for that kind of experimentation that Netflix suggests to us, right? I mean, I'm probably the only person in this room. I've gone through all the Bridgerton stories entirely from a sociological perspective, sociological interest. And it is actually quite insidious because I've got no problem with white people playing black people and black people playing white people. That's perfectly all right. And I've got no problem with Jewish people playing Christians and vice versa. And that's acting. You know, you're acting, so you're allowed to be whoever you are when you're acting. But this is something very, very different. It's basically to suggest that our past, or that kind of the way things were, is being reorganized and being rearranged in this breaking down of temporal distinctions. So it's almost like they are rearranging our past for us, which wouldn't be a problem if it's just a TV program, but when it basically leads to a situation where people begin to forget where they've come from, who they are, where our memories is gradually being distorted, and this kind of sense of amnesia begins to kick in, it is a problem. I mean, we already suffer from amnesia, historical amnesia, because history has been marginalized in so many universities. History has been marginalized in schools. But that kind of amnesia that's being gradually introduced among the young is then made far worse by this distorted sensibility that is kind of communicated. And ultimately, I wrote this book for the kids, for the younger generations. You know, we've lost, according to my calculation, almost 4 generations of young people in England who have been brought up on a history where they're basically learning that the past is a history of shame. They've learned that there's very little to be proud about if you're British, that being British is not something that you should feel comfortable with. That on the contrary, you should be questioning your Britishness. You should be, in some shape or form, becoming alienated, estranged from the outlook of your parents and your ancestors. And what's happening quite systematically is that young people are becoming disinherited from the legacy of their past. This is what's really important here, because most people in this room, no matter how old we are, we still remember. You know, we still remember that Churchill was not a war criminal, right? We still remember that in the Second World War, Hitler was the bad guy, not Churchill. So there are many, many things like this we still remember. But if you, for example, in America, read some of the discussions that are going on about the British Empire, and Britain as well now, you will learn that there's an increasing tendency to suggest that it's wrong to talk about the good bits and the bad bits of the British Empire. That is not the way you should be looking at it. The British Empire should be judged in the same light as Nazi Germany. And what they really mean is that very few of us would say that Nazi Germany had some good bits. You know, there were some concentration camps that were actually quite comfortable compared to the really bad ones. We don't say that. But we say that it was all bad. Now, that's really what they were trying to get us to say in relation to our different experiences in history. This leads to a situation where a kind of new hegemony, a new historical hegemony is in the ascendancy, which disrupts the socialization of young people. See, the way that I look at it is that we know that a lot of young people have got problems with their identities. A lot of people are ambivalent as to who they are. They are confused about what has taken place. And we have tried to find psychological explanations for that. We blame the social media. We blame all kinds of extraneous external factors as to why the young appear to find it so difficult to find their way in the world. But actually, there's a very simple reason for that. A very simple reason for that. If you don't know where you come from, if you don't know where you come from, you don't know who you are. You really struggle to know who you are. Unless you got some organic relationship that binds you to something that preceded you, unless that organic relationship exists intact, young people will inevitably in a situation where they simply don't know who they are and they haven't got a sensibility of where the direction of travel they should embark in. So in a sense, what we are confronted with is a situation is that by depriving young people of that organic connection with what has preceded beforehand, we deprive them of a possibility of they being able to work on their own identity. They being able to overcome their identity crisis, which is what every generation in modern times has had to do. And what I want to argue is that everything that we noticed about the identity crisis of the young, the so-called mental health epidemic that we see among young people, everything that is confusing and disorienting young people is ultimately linked to the disrupted socialization that has occurred when we cannot tell them a nice story, an inspiring story about who we are and where we come from. So there's a lot at stake here, and I wrote the book basically because I want to do my bit to ensure that future generations of young people do not have to go the same direction as the previous ones, but in particular, we as adults take our time, take our responsibility to ensure that we fight their conditional social amnesia and acquaint them with the beauty as well as the bad sides of our civilization. Because I think at the end of the day, our job is to hold the line. Really, I'm serious about that. We got to hold the line and make sure that this war is not able to advance further by destroying our past. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. Please give us your responding thoughts.
Thank you so much. Ladies and gentlemen, it is for me a most profoundly encouraging experience to see such an enormous audience of what I presume to be, with very good grounds, like-minded people. On the way here, I walked past the BBC, and there was a big queue outside. What they thought, I don't know what they were queuing for. I've not got the faintest idea. But you must remember, you are the majority. Well, I have the pleasure and privilege of responding to a most remarkable book. All of you should own a copy. And more than that, you should introduce it to your friends, launch a debate about it, indeed ask your MP to take action in the light of it. This book is important because Professor Furedi, more than any other author I know, has mapped out for us a key identifier of the woke war. In his model, the woke war is not a collection of independent campaigns against this or that unrelated feature of our society. These campaigns display a common strategy. They all entail a rejection in one way or another of the past and its authority for the present. As Professor Furedi argues, and I quote him, the territory of the past is the most important site on which the culture wars are fought. That is a tall claim, and I think it's correct. I entirely agree. How do I respond? He writes as a sociologist of a disembodied thing called history. As an historian, I see historiography, that is what historians write. I observe that historians sometimes disagree, and Professor Furedi documents this very embarrassingly, but then on the other hand, so do sociologists. We can, I say, trace these historians' theories as we can trace the theories of woke warriors. And once we have an accurate map of the battlefield, we can decide how to fight the battle. So my remarks are briefly to draw your attention to some key themes in the book, and then very briefly to suggest how we might take them forward. Professor Furedi kindly quotes an observation I made in 2004, that what you're looking at, he quotes, a distinct enterprise of historical disinheritance. So he and I are natural allies. But my word, disinheritance, is only a metaphor. If we investigate historical phenomena without using metaphors, we may be able to map them more accurately. One possibility is this. The cancel culture is not as new as it thinks it is or claims to be. It is instead the latest example of the movement that historians call iconoclasm, the destruction of religious images, statues, carvings, stained glass, or relics. Again, during the American Revolution, statues of George III and royal coats of arms were torn down. After the fall of communism in the USSR, statues of Lenin and Stalin were toppled. With the rise of groups believing themselves to be identified by skin color, statues of Southern generals in the American War of 1861-5 were similarly demolished. I would add that cancel culture was in many ways alive and well in the minds of the class of 1968. They wanted to destroy Western civilization by destroying the university as the custodian of the past. But there are also differences. Why do the wokists react so openly against the past as such, that is, all of it? One answer is that the past is a great body of pragmatic evidence created by very large numbers of people in very many situations that is likely to help solve present-day problems. It is a store of experience that therefore carries more weight than principles do. That is, the more than the few and generalized principles recently invented by the wokists. And their principles are, I contend, few and recent. I suggest another complementary reason. The three great monotheistic religions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, are all essentially historical. But more than that, they claim to demonstrate historically the truth of revelation. What the major figures now retrospectively recruited into that recent category called the Enlightenment had in common was usually religious skepticism, especially a rejection of revelation. Is the same true today? Has secularization, whatever we mean by that, swept Western cultures with great success since 1968? For it seems that the target of the wokists is not just religion, but historically documented monotheistic religions, proposing revelation as a source of truth and as a restraint on behavior. That's how they see morality. I hear no wokist outcries against the self-appointed Druids who gather at Stonehenge each year to affirm their access to even older forms of religious belief. In reality, of course, these forms are wholly invented by these present-day so-called Druids who still appeal to an older past with the claim that it is close to nature. If so, there's little to be gained by urging wokists to go back to their places of worship. They have long left them. But the woke warriors are aiming mainly to discredit if they're aiming mainly to discredit religious revelation, are they throwing the baby out with the bathwater? Are they willing to negate all of humanity's achievement over time, or at least Western humanities? What is left? Are we to defend what some people call present values? But what are present values? No values can be securely established as present ones, excluding other claimants, so that we need other strategies. But if the wokist values have no historiographical grounding, it suggests that what they're really engaged in is a power play. If so, it may be only a question of time before those whose main aims are the pursuit of peace and prosperity, maybe us, turn against the wokists in the face of war and poverty. The activists of Just Stop Oil are less than self-aware. They assume that their local branch of Waitrose will remain open after fossil fuel use is terminated. No worry about the supply chain there. A century ago, and this is serious though, their great-grandparents were preoccupied with private profit as the cause of the anticipated Marxist revolution. The great-grandchildren are preoccupied with the private emission of carbon dioxide as the cause of the anticipated end of the world. But Armageddon tends not to happen. In its absence, societies need arguments to justify their values. What arguments do we turn to? There is, maintains Professor Furedi at the end of his book, a self-correcting mechanism that ensures that despite setbacks, his values will prevail sooner or later. So he's more of an optimist than I am. If they don't prevail sooner, how can we be confident that they will prevail even later? And where? In Russia, China, Iran, North Korea? I suggest that there is another strategy that we can adopt in order to win the woke war. It involves challenging the notion of a distinction between past and present. What is the past? Is it that which is stored in our memories? If so, it must include all sense impressions up to the very last one, which arrived in our minds an unmeasurably tiny fraction of a second ago. The more we examine the present, the more it shrinks. In everyday usage, of course, the present means a continuum during which things remain much the same. But this assumption is untenable. Nothing is sustainable. Sustainability, marvelous idea, but nothing is sustainable. Everything changes. Everything is temporary. As to the future, it is for us a blank. Historians, humanity cannot know what lies behind that blank. The more we examine the future, the blanker it looks. So in humanity's everyday experience, the past is all there is. The terms past and present express a misunderstanding. So what am I recommending we do? What's my reply to the presentists? Answer, we abolish the present. And I suggest a more powerful argument to support that conclusion. Everyday talk about past, present, and future assumes that time is linear, like a ball of string unrolling across a tabletop. But physicists tell us that time isn't like that. It's not like a ball of string. Instead, they say space-time is a dimension, so that for every given moment in time, all space is simultaneously present, and for any given point in space, all time is simultaneously present. It follows that the past isn't past at all. The past isn't ours, like an old painting that we inherit. The past is ours because we are in it now, in all of it, just as we are in a landscape or in a townscape. The past isn't remote from us, it is present in the sense that the land we own is present. So if the present shrinks out of sight, then we should have no reluctance to invoke the past against the wokists. It cannot be obsolete because it, all of it, is here and now. We are it. Professor Furedi correctly writes, and I quote him, "The past is anachronistically rewritten in accordance with the playbook of contemporary identity politics." There is the challenge. We must write the history of contemporary identity politics to show how it is itself rooted in history, but only shallowly rooted in the history of the 1990s and after. Identity politics is much more recent than we think, and therefore I suggest it is much weaker. Many of the demands to decolonize the curriculum or to blame the Church of England for the slave trade are essentially normative. Moral judgments appeal especially to the young, who can, in the nature of things, as yet know little of the evidence, but they seek a shortcut to the truth that confers power on themselves. But history is not an easy and normative study. It is a difficult and technical discipline whose very different tasks is to discover when, how, and why things happened as they did, how things changed over time, and the differences between historic individuals and present ones. The historical answers often prove to be inconvenient for the wokists. So again, I say many of the things that we here today object to may be no older than about the 1990s, when, incidentally, natural rights discourse began to proliferate. There's academic work on this, which I won't bother you with now, but there is academic work which says it really exploded in the 1990s. All claimants could thereafter base their claims on natural rights denied. They became the victims of those who deny them their natural rights. Their victimhood becomes, in the recently fashionable expression, their identity. This, of course, dishonors real victims. The history of this recent doctrine can be written, and it will, I submit, be an ally of the sociology of that recent position so well set out by Professor Furedi. But until we can make this alliance of history and sociology real, the wokists do damage. If time is accepted as being linear, then Professor Furedi rightly contends that today's young are being cut off from their past and taught not to take pride in it. In order to re-equip them, I suggest that we must go further than arguing that their parents and grandparents did many good things as well as a few bad ones. We need to take the battle to the wokists in respect of method and to explain how, when, and why they came to adopt the damaging opinions that they now hold. Professor Furedi acutely identifies a flaw in their front line, seemingly presented by the wokists, a flaw that we can exploit to break up their position. He points to two conflicting groups in their ranks. The presentists want to reach back into the past to condemn all those who then held different values from the wokists' own. But the adherents of year zero ideology want to argue that all of the past is now irrelevant and must be dismissed. We must begin again at year zero. These two positions sound very plausible, but of course, as Professor Furedi points out to us, they are mutually destructive. They hate the past. The adherents of these positions hate the past, but in different ways. Can they then be encouraged to hate each other? Furedi adds that those fighting a war against the past are inadvertently denying themselves the capacity to win. If presentists complain that the past is evil, what resources can they draw on in order to do good? I add, if net zero ideologists dismiss all of the past, whence can their better ideas come? Has anyone ever constructed a political program from first principles? We need only ask the historical question, where did those first principles come from? Well, I presented you with some very abstract arguments, and for this I apologize. But the wokists' arguments are no less abstract. We, I think, in this room probably typically first become aware of the problem when we find ourselves indignant at the toppling of statues or the subversion of a curriculum or the relabeling of paintings in galleries or the cancellation of speakers. I don't know how I managed to get in here, but anyway, I did. But I invite you to take the battle to the abstractions of the wokists. Professor Furedi eloquently reminds us of what is at stake. He rightly perceives that, and I quote him, in its most extreme form, this, the wokist outlook, expresses a loathing for humanity. And so this great book begins as a defense of the past. It ends as a defense of humanity itself, surveying a wide array of debates. That is one reason why this book is so important. It gives us a map of the battlefield. It is up to us, to all of us now, to fight the battle. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jonathan. Frank, do you want to say anything in response to Jonathan's challenge?
Can I stand for that?
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
Yes, so one of the things that I have a lot of arguments about, and I get criticized for by a lot of my friends, mainly in Europe, who are of a conservative disposition, is the fact that, unlike them, I don't see a kind of coherent ideological project at play. In fact, what we call wokeism, I call in my second to last book, an ideology without a name. And what I mean by that is that very often the things that they are expressing and the way they're behaving is not something that is consciously articulated. But nevertheless, by analyzing them, you know how they're going to behave. So for example, I was talking to my wife on October the 8th, a day after the terrible events in Israel. And I told her that I bet you that when push comes to shove, all the wokeist people, all the LGBTQ types, will find that they have more in common with Hamas than they do with Israel. And it's almost without a blink of an eye. Didn't have to even think about it. It wasn't like they kind of sat down and read books about Palestine or Israel. It wasn't like they had a deep dive into the history of the Middle East. But they just knew instinctively that they were, on Hamas's side, that Hamas was their people. And that, I think, indicates that there is some coherence there. But the coherence is something that we have to make conscious for them. So this book, for example, is really an attempt to make conscious what they themselves do not quite understand. Because they have certain projects that are quite discrete and quite specific. But what they haven't got yet is a ideological coherence. That may happen at some point later on, but that is not something that you can really sort of specify. And this leads me to what I think is my main difference with Jonathan, but also with a lot of my friends and colleagues, is I don't think that it's possible, or is possible, but I don't think it's legitimate, given what we know about the history, to draw a connection between what we see as wokeism and movements in the past. I know, for example, I was in a big debate in Brussels where people were talking about how cultural Marxism inevitably leads to this wokist kind of reactions. Other people talked about Puritanism. You know, the Puritans were like the ancestors of contemporary woke politics. People almost tried to create this, what I call teleology of evil, that there's a kind of process, there's a link between what has gone on beforehand, which inexorably leads to the kind of stuff that has gone on. Because if you look at what's happened in different moments, whether it's May 68, whether it's the different revolutionary movements of the interwar period, whether it's the French Revolution, we're talking about something very, very different. You know, there's a very famous quotation from Marx in the 18th of Brumaire, where he talks about how the French revolutionaries made their revolution wearing the clothes of the Roman Empire and wearing basically speaking the affectations of historical figures in the Roman Republic. And what he's really getting at, you know, sort of, is basically a very simple fact that all these radical revolutionaries interpreted their behavior through the prism of historical figures that has gone on beforehand. In other words, for them, you know, they saw themselves as being, in some shape or form, the inheritors of a particular radical legacy. And that was the case all the way through. You don't find that woke people, that wokist activists, are kind of tearing down statues, wearing the clothes of any kind of historical figures. It's almost as if they begin from scratch, from a kind of year zero kind of movement. I think this is really quite important, because if you're looking at this development that we're confronted with as really the inexorable consequence of something that was put into motion in a previous era, then we lose sight of the fact that we are talking about something that is almost like a bar of soap that goes right through your hands. I mean, they themselves are behaving in such a way that you can't really nail them down. If you take their own statements seriously, you got to rework and expand what they are really all about. The one point that Jonathan makes that is really quite important, and it's something that I didn't get a chance to elaborate, but I want to get back to, is the anti-humanist dimension. Because if you are genuinely anti-humanist, you don't need history. You don't need any kind of historical consciousness. Because if you look at, for example, the environmentalist movement, the deep green environmentalists, what is their model, right? What is it that they think is really, really good? It's not something that we human beings have created. It's this pre-human past where the planet existed without our bothersome, guilty human beings ruining it. It's almost as if their dehumanized, misanthropic sensibility gets to the point at which that they really do regard human beings in a very negative way. And that's what the War of the Past is all about, because if it's genuinely the case that all these individuals that we thought were great were actually guilty of all kinds of crimes and were behaving in that kind of offensive way, what we are really saying is that human beings are nothing much to write home about. They really haven't done anything particularly remarkable over the centuries. And it's this lowering of the value of what a human being is all about, what we expect of a human being to do, that I think ultimately explains a lot about wokeism. It also explains why they can so casually support Hamas and claim that on October 7th, nothing unusual happened, nothing terrible, tragic happened. And that kind of thinking, that kind of anti-humanist ideals that they kind of possess is something that we need to confront. Because when you dehumanize human experience to the point that they've done, we have a very big sort of challenge on our hands.
Thank you, Frank. I'm aware of time ticking away, so I'm going to come straight out to the room, if that's okay, and you'll have time to come back and answer questions as they get asked. Vinay has 2 microphones. I'm not sure how you're going to make that work, but run in 2 directions. We can, but maybe Omar could help as well. So if we start at the back, there's a chap at the back with a white shirt, and then the chap in the green jacket with a hand up here.
To the point that Professor Furedi was just making about the anti-humanism, I wonder if there's also an argument that underpinning the philosophy is actually a regression to pre-civilization and almost animalism, in the, which is underpinning the year zero and presentism. Because if you think, our consciousness and what they're attacking in fighting language and recorded history is they're breaking that link between what is written, and that is what is unique in humanity, is our ability to write and communicate from the past to the, or from now to the future. And that is not present in past civilizations, and you would see that where incoming monarchs would destroy the records of the past and those kinds of things, or animals simply didn't have the capacity to record things other than by oral tradition, which could be rewritten in real time.
Thank you. Do you want to respond to that, Frank?
Yeah, I mean, I agree. In fact, if I could rewrite this book, your authors always feel that they missed something. I would have a chapter on civilization, and an idea I've been developing is the idea of de-civilization, which is what we're seeing, where essentially civilizational accomplishments are self-consciously being rolled backwards. And I think that thing is really quite important. In the book, I actually make the point that there are examples where monarchs would destroy all evidence of the previous monarchs, which is a very discrete reaction. What we're talking about is not just simply destroying the evidence of a previous monarch, it's destroying the evidence of everything. And I think that is one big difference between the way that kind of year zero ideology worked in very discrete terms in previous times.
Jonathan, do you have any response to that?
A thought occurs to me. I'm not sure if it's relevant or not to what's just been said, but can I say it anyway? Who was that French sociologist in the 1960s who said, you can't say these things now, I apologize for quoting him. He said the thing about savages, savage peoples, is that they exist on what he called an island of time. The expanse, their memory was so restricted. And I think if we're talking about civilization, it ought to involve humanity finding mental strategies to vastly expand the time frame within which they see themselves.
Thank you, that's really helpful. I've just got the chap behind in the green, and then we'll come here.
A question for both our speakers. You described how we've gone effectively from woke academia to Netflix and the BBC and so on. Have we now gone full circle where dramas on Netflix and the BBC are inspiring the next generation of historians who are viewing history through a made-up lens?
Thank you.
We'll see. I think that what we are seeing is a lot of young people actually being indoctrinated, and I use the word indoctrinated very carefully, by a vision of the past that is entirely the product of zealotry and ideological fantasy. So it's kind of a magical past that's being created, which they basically assume is the way it was.
But can I ask you then, Frank, how can they both be unconscious? I say they, I don't quite know who the they are. Why do people fall into one camp or the other? How can they be both zealous and unconscious?
Well, if you take your identity very, very seriously, then basically what you're saying is, I'm trans. That's me, I'm really trans. And there must have been people like me in all the different periods of history. And, and if there weren't, I'll make sure that we become aware of that. So there's a kind of combination of self-deception, and it's a genuine self-deception, and at the same time the feeling that, things were just like they are now. And it's something that, once you begin to think that way, you really become quite committed to that. And you really basically want to queer everything. And, you get the situation where you look at an ancient building, an ancient site, and you look for evidence of traces of trans identity. And if you look hard enough, you're going to find what you look for. It's called a self-fulfilling prophecy. We know how self-fulfilling prophecy works. And I think that is both can be mediated through a very zealous behavior, but at the same time, they themselves don't think that they're kind of making it up entirely. They actually believe that Queen Elizabeth, because she was a tough chick, must have been sexually ambivalent. So that's the conclusion they would draw. And you must know people who belong to sexual minorities, and they always talk about people who are like themselves, and that person, they pick historical favorite figures who they attribute with the same kind of passions as they have. That's, but this is like taken to an extreme.
Okay, thank you. Yes, wait for the microphone. Dora, wait.
Something. No, I don't need it.
Yeah, you do need it, because otherwise people can't hear you at home.
I speak quite loudly, I think. I just want to say that it's not such a long history ago. The Holocaust. The Holocaust happened just, what? We all know when it happened. None of you, I hope, have forgotten it. How can this anti-Semitism happen again? And how can the 7th of October just being pushed aside just like that by young people, by thousands of people demonstrating non-stop? How can that forgotten? For God's sake, this is not such a long, long history ago. Sorry.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, but I mean, that's what historical amnesia is about. Yeah, and we have forgotten the Holocaust. Not me, but not us. But if you look at the world, I mean, you had a situation last week on the Tucker Carlson show, where you had this so-called historian basically arguing that Churchill was the evil character, Hitler was, not a bad guy, and the reason why Jewish people died in the concentration camps was because German people didn't have time to take care of them. The exigencies of the war meant that they couldn't, sort of do what had to be done to save them. So, in a sense, we are living in a world where, month by month, year by year, more and more people forget what the real Holocaust was about, and they're encouraging that thinking, because now what's happened is it's been flipped.
The chap just behind in the white shirt.
In this day and age, when there's so much information, so much confusion about what is reality and what is fact, as historians, how do you navigate through all of this stuff to try and work out what is correct and when you should believe what is your gut and when you should challenge yourself? Because I think it's so easy to be led down a track where you may end up in a situation or an area you think, well, hang on a second, am I the bad guy? So how do you, what is your North Star to make sure that you keep to what you feel is the right path?
Thank you. Frank? Sorry, I'll come to you.
Well, I think there's a danger, all of us who are doing this work, of becoming caricatures of ourselves. And there's a danger that once you get an idea, then you see that idea appearing everywhere because you're looking for it. And therefore, I sometimes become guilty of kind of almost like knowing in advance, what something is. So, for example, today, somebody gave me a document published by the European Union called Europe's Historical Conscience. And I was immediately looking for the bad stuff because I knew that it would be that EU is like one of the worst perpetrators of the rewriting of history in this sense. And then I said to myself, be generous, don't be a caricature of yourself. And that's how we got to proceed. And in my case, I'm blessed by the fact that I got friends who are critical of what I say and question what I do, and very often point out the fact that I need to rein back and I have to rethink. I think as historians, sociologists, we need to expose ourselves to criticism so that we are continually, the more we're challenged, the more we are able to get a kind of right kind of balance, and we learn from that. And I think that's really the beauty of genuine academic experience, which at the moment is very difficult to find because most academics in British universities only talk to people like themselves, and they are rather reluctant to expose themselves to real, genuine intellectual scrutiny.
Jonathan.
To answer the question, I think we must bear in mind that history, like physics, is a difficult technical discipline. And unless people begin to study it at school and then go on to study it at university, they will take their historical ideas from the television. What should we do in these circumstances? Well, I can only suggest that life is quite possible without a television. I don't own one. I have never owned one. I think it's a great help. Think of the time I have saved. But looking, as I occasionally do, at other people's television sets, I'm astonished at what passes for history. I myself have no doubt whatsoever about the reality of the Holocaust, but I have grave doubts about the reality of the BBC.
Yes, we'd better do some over this side. At the very back, Ella's got her hand up there.
Much for your speeches are really interesting, and I was just really thinking back to when I was studying history as an undergraduate, and we had lessons in historiography, and it was incredibly interesting to look at the past and how we can study it through different methods. Gender was always presented as a method that we could use, and to me it always seemed like almost like the easy option. It's quite easy to do well in gender because you just need to give the right moral answers. You need to kind of say the same things. What can we do to encourage young people to maybe take the harder path in university?
Jonathan, do you want to go first?
Well, I think this distinguished society can have a very great role here, and there is an ally called History Reclaimed. Their work, which is now available on the internet, is another very important society of historians who believe in evidence, evidence-based research, and not taking for granted what groupthink dictates. So I think we should do our best to make common cause and to draw attention as far as is possible to the existence of groups of people who are not dictated to by the conventional fashion in the academic marketplace.
And Frank, I mean, my perception is that a lot of younger people are actually very interested in history. I think they feel like they have been deprived during their schooling and possibly at university. And they're obviously unleashed then upon the internet where they can find all kinds of things and also finding books. What's your view? Do you think, can people kind of self-help themselves out of this historical amnesia? Well,
I mean, kids naturally love history. It's one of the first things they're drawn towards. But what happens is in the British curriculum and most Western curriculums, we teach history in such a way as to make them bored and switch them off, because what we do is instead of teaching history in a way that it should be taught, it's done in modules. And I don't know if you got children, but you'll find that your 15-year-old kid will come back, and they have a module in the Tudors, and a module about Nazi Germany, and maybe a module about health, medical history, completely unconnected, right? And therefore, if that's history, then you're not going to get turned on by the beauty of the subject. So I think the first thing that we need to do is change the curriculum, but that also requires we need different schools, because I don't think that public education is capable of doing that. And that seems to me the big task of how we educate young people in a way that history becomes something that's normal and natural at a much earlier age than we do it at the moment. And not only becomes normal and natural, but history as a discipline is something that we expect all pupils to do for at least 8 years, and isn't something that we kind of introduce here and there as an option, and which I think basically devalues the status, the importance of history as a key element in young people's education.
Thank you. Jonathan, you wanted to say something?
Yes, I'm old enough now that I remember what academic historians used to deal with. When I was at school and was attracted to take history as a subject at university, I was aware of historians who were talking about issues like war and peace, so that diplomatic history and the outbreak of wars was an extremely important and salient question. They were talking about poverty versus riches. In other words, socialism versus capitalism. This is a subject well worth debating. They were talking about despotism versus constitutional government. Constitutional history was then taken seriously as a subject. It has faded away. And so what happens in many countries that call themselves democratic, we see a whole variety of practices intruding into the parliamentary arena in a whole variety of countries that give deep concern to people who have some greater knowledge. We debated back then questions of salvation and damnation. The history of religion was taken seriously. Not small issues for each individual, but all these things have been swept away now from academic curriculums.
Okay, just one small thing, which is, in the end, the problem will not be cracked in schools and in the curriculum, because in the end, it's a cultural matter. So if we teach young people outside of school to disrespect anything that is old, if basically we make them obsessed about the novelty of the new, then it's not surprising that this is the attitude that they have. So if, for example, if you're a young parent and you get a parenting book, the first thing you're told by these parenting experts is not to listen to the advice of the grandmother, because the grandmother's wisdom is likely to be unscientific and is not up to speed with the latest expert insights. And if you look at just the way in which anything that is old is devalued and made fun of in every aspect of our culture, then that underpins the curriculum and underpins the attitude that we have. Because if you have learned from the subliminal signals from the world around you that things that are old are best rejected, they're best kind of ignored, then it's not surprising that when you look at history, you will have a certain kind of negative attitudes that is very difficult to overcome just by good historiography or good history teaching.
Thank you. Yeah, the chap over there.
Picking up that point about curriculum, I wonder if either of our speakers have got anything to say about the reframing of history as symbolic violence. So I raise this because it's the concern of Professor Becky Francis, who is about to review the curriculum across all schools for the Labour government. So I just wondered if we had a way of interrogating this idea of symbolic violence before the whole of history becomes symbolic violence.
Could you pass the microphone there? And if you would like to ask your question now as well.
Yes, because it's quite related. You said before...
Just hold the microphone by your mouth.
Professor Furedi, yeah. You said before that you used the word indoctrination, and you said you were cautious about that, but I'm not cautious at all. I believe that this is happening in schools, and I'm talking personal experience. I've been in the education sector for a while, and having a teenage boy now, I can tell you that when he comes back from school, if you will see his exercise book in history, you won't believe it. So we have a proper, I would say, indoctrination, biased teaching in humanities, history, geography. So my question is, what do we do about that? Do you think that there is a remedy, there is a cure? Can we save our educational institutions? And by institutions, I mean primary and secondary schools, because by the time that they reach universities, it's too late. Or we should start from the scratch and do what they are doing in the States. You know, they are creating their own educational institutions. So can we fix the problem within our public mainstream education, or we should create our own institutions? Thank you.
Thank you. Any views on that, Frank?
Well, unfortunately, I take a very pessimistic view, because I think that the problem that we have is, first of all, teachers' training, the way that teachers are trained, which is intellectually extremely Philistine. I mean, I know there are some really good teachers, but really the teaching profession is not what it used to be in terms of its intellectual curiosity, in terms of that sense of gravitas that you expect from teachers. And you have a school system that is going to be reducing history to, as you were saying, to symbolic violence. Basically, if the logic of this goes through, then basically history will have a no trespass sign to it. So that's not going to happen. At the moment, all that we can do is find individual solutions. And I think it's the job of every parent not to allow your kids to be simply influenced by their schools. You have to do what I call debriefing them, which basically means your kid comes home, suppose I got an imaginary child. I would then say, this is what the schools say, and this is what the Furedis think, right? And you got to do that from a very early age, because if you don't do it, then you will lose them. I mean, you will definitely lose them. And therefore, every parent has got to make a bit of an effort to counter the negative influences that are going to emanate. Now, having said that, I know some really good history teachers as individuals, but they are a really small minority. And therefore, I think that until we begin to build new teachers' training colleges, not that we need teachers' training colleges, because the best teachers are the ones that get a good degree in history. They don't need to have pedagogy as part of their sort of curriculum vitae. But new teachers' training college and new schools, we have to basically build our own schools just to demonstrate to the rest of the world what can be done.
Jonathan.
Can I briefly say that I'm not involved in the actual work of schools, so all I can do is to begin to offer some arguments against the notion of symbolic violence. I would say that it mocks the victims of real violence, and we should study the victims of real violence. Similarly, the notion of microaggression mocks the victims of real aggression. We should begin to study real aggressions, not these fictions.
Thank you. Right, Vinay is going to just read the top question from the Q&A, if you can.
So the question that's quite popular is about why this sort of attack that we're seeing is predominantly targeted to the West. So why is this about an attack on the Western past? The person said, I don't see any equivalent attacks on Asian, East Asian, African or South African past. If anything, the latter are painted in a better light when it comes to historical revisions.
Oh, brilliant question. Thank you.
Well, I mean, what is really at stake as a bottom line is an attempt to destroy the legacy of Western civilization, its historical accomplishment. That's why you had a situation where there is so much sympathy for Hamas. So, I got this picture on my desk, and it shows a bunch of Columbia University students in New York, basically saying, "Let's destroy Western civilization," wearing Palestinian scarves. So for them, destroying, and they do mean destroy Western civilization, and the struggle, the struggle of Hamas is equivalent. And that's why it's not surprising that Israel is hated so much, because at the end of the day, for better or worse, and Israel is not made up of just angels, Israel symbolizes Western civilization within the Middle East. And we know that if Israel goes, if it goes under, then its impact on Europe and European civilization will be horrendous. It's not going to stop in the Middle East. So that I think is why you have this situation. And what's very interesting for me is if I talk to Chinese colleagues in China, they have, as university academics, they have more respect for Western civilization than Western academics. And they read more of our canons. I mean, they read Aristotle. They take Aristotle seriously. They read some of the heroes of the Renaissance, and they take it all very, very seriously. And they're bemused by the fact that these books, these great philosophies, which they in China take seriously, are dismissed as just the Western canon within American Ivy universities.
Jonathan.
We're talking here in broad categories, but let's always remember that Western civilization is made up of many phenomena which are grouped under that label. I would suggest that if we're talking about Western civilization, we need to remember that Judaism and Christianity have a very large part to play in it, and the position in it of Islam is now deeply in question. Western civilization is rather a secularized concept, but we should not stop there. We should look at the commitments, the human commitments, the deepest commitments that have led people forward over many centuries, and those tend to be religious ones.
Thank you. I'm going to I'm aware that we have lots of wine and beer waiting for us out there, and so I know there's some hands up, but I'm going to disappoint you. And I just wanted to ask you to conclude by just answering a sort of final question. I mean, I think the questions you're raising are being asked by a lot of people at the moment. So I don't think that either of you are beleaguered or isolated in that sense. And clearly, we're in a room together. So, and I think the questions about Judeo-Christian past are coming up all the time in all kinds of different fora. So I wondered, what is your view? Is there a counter movement that you think can be formed and taken forwards? Because I do find when I read the book, it's obviously we're right to be worried, and I think October the 7th really was sort of brought these tendencies to life in a very, very shocking way that hopefully will have actually alerted an awful lot of people to what these ideas mean in practice. But I just wondered whether what's your point? What's your view on the prospects for actually forging something that really can challenge these trends?
Well, there are two trends. There is the bad trend, and yes, there may be some interest in Judeo-Christian ideals, but when you have the head of the Anglican Church basically saying that we shouldn't use the word church anymore, we should talk about something new, then you know that Anglicanism is in deep shit, basically. It's got some very serious problems. And in general, when you look at the Christian institutions, with some honorable exceptions in Europe, you'll find that either they're very defensive or they've gone over the wrong side of history, the Pope included, as it happens, this Pope particularly. So we have a problem from above, but at the same time, there is something in the air. And what I feel is that when I enter the senior common room of a university, I'm in enemy territory, and I'm not the most popular guy. In fact, I feel like Dracula. I expect crosses to be held up. But when I go watch football on a Saturday and I talk to people who are there, the people of normal people of everyday life, I feel that I got more in common with them. And therefore, especially if you look at the recent elections in Europe, it's really fantastic what's been happening on the European continent, how these woke ideologies are being rejected left and right. I do think that the solution lies in believing in people. And if you believe in people, then the job of people like myself and of Jonathan is to provide them with the intellectual resources to gain the kind of clarity that's necessary. And I've decided, against the advice of my friends who call themselves conservative, that instead of calling myself conservative, I now call myself populist and support populism, because that is the way to make the kind of, I actually believe in that, that's the way to make the kind of connections that are necessary to fight back. It's going to be from below rather than from above.
Thank you, Frank. Jonathan, final.
Briefly, what then shall we do? I come back to the insight that was put into my mind by the queue outside the BBC when I arrived here. You are the majority, so you should act like a majority.
Thank you, Jonathan.